for the very first segment of philosophy, I want to talk to you and spend some time talking today about first what philosophy isn't, and then we'll talk about what it is. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion out there about philosophy and what philosophy is, and so I think just one thing that would be smart of us to do just right at the very front end is to talk about what some of the misconceptions are. What are the misconceptions regarding philosophy? I'm sure there's probably some things that you heard about philosophy when maybe you told someone, oh, I'm taking a philosophy class or whatever. And maybe you had some ideas of your own that you picked up along the way. I think what happens is we kind of pick up from the culture, pop culture, ideas about philosophy that are oftentimes, maybe there's a grain of truth in them, but they're mistaken. They're either incomplete or insufficient or just wrong. And so what happens is, I think philosophy has kind of an image problem. There's people out there that are just like, oh, philosophy is just a waste of time. And I think that's people who don't know very much about philosophy, honestly. They don't understand what it's about. We'll see if we can first kind of clear the decks of some of those confused ideas. And the way we do that, the way we're going to do that today is we'll start off with what's called critique. The idea of critique. We're going to do a critique of the popular culture ideas about philosophy. What is a critique? A critique is a critical estimate or discussion. A critique is a critical estimate or discussion. And what a critique is a tool that is within the philosopher's toolkit that we use quite frequently. It's kind of the standard tool. We use this all the time. And what its purpose is clarifying. Critique is designed to clarify ideas, clarify positions, arguments. We use this tool quite frequently. And so as a way of introducing you to philosophy, I thought we would use this tool just at the outset. We'll start there to talk about some of the confusions about what philosophy is. Now, I want to emphasize this importance of clarification because there's so much, when you use a term like philosophy, it's an abstract concept. And so that's the reason that there's oftentimes confusion. If we're talking about something more concrete like this marker, then there'd be less confusion. If I said to you, do you know what a marker is? You would say, yeah, I do. See? But if I say to you, do you know what philosophy is? I think I might. And that's just kind of that's where most people are on it. But what I'd suggest to you is usually they're wrong. And we, as human beings, we're wrong quite a lot, actually, about things. So let me just see if I can kind of help clarify a little bit. So what I'm going to give you is 4 misconceptions of pop culture about philosophy. 4 misconceptions of pop culture, popular culture about philosophy. The first one is simply this: philosophy is how you or I feel about something. Philosophy is how you or I feel about something. Notice that. That's an important word there. How you or I feel about something. That's what a lot of people reduce philosophy to. They reduce it to subjective emotions, feelings, etc. And nothing can be further from the truth. Philosophy is not about feelings as much as it is about reasons. Reasons for thinking about the world in the way that we do. It's not feelings. Feelings are not very trustworthy, honestly. Feelings are wrong. They're confused. Many times our feelings are not accurate. And so I think what people mean by this is, or the way they think about it is they're saying it's like a gut intuition. The world is this way. But just think for a minute about how many times you've been wrong when you follow gut intuitions. Now you may say, well, sometimes I'm right. Okay, I'd agree with that. But we're wrong quite often. Our gut intuitions are wrong. And so philosophy is much more concerned about reasons. So let me just make this point to you. Let me just ask this question. I'll throw it out there. I read a book earlier this year. Well, I guess it was, it's now January, isn't it? So I read a book in the summer of last year. It's called Being Wrong. It's by an author by the name of Kathryn Schultz, Schultz. And what she writes about is how that wrongness actually helps us to grow as human beings. That our potential for greatness is not connected to rightness, but wrongness. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? But what she's saying is that it's when we realize that we're wrong, that we're then ready to move ahead to try to figure out what is correct and what is right. Now, all of us have a kind of certitude that we're right. So, I've got Ashlyn here and Kevin and Fabian and Delaney and Josh. And if I were to talk to you and you were to begin discussing with me certain topics that you're very passionate about, you might well be virtually certain that you knew what you needed to know and that you were right in your intuitions. That's just kind of our human psychology. That's our makeup. But one of the things that Dr. Schultz brings forward is that not so fast with that. And see, this is what philosophy does. It's always asking these kinds of questions of us. So let me give you the first question she asked straight out of the book. What does it feel like to be wrong? What does it feel like to be wrong? So let me just throw that out there. What does it feel like? Okay, it's embarrassing. Kind of get flush. I've been found out. I was wrong. What else? Makes you doubt yourself. You're less certain. Okay. Other things. Awkward. A piece of embarrassment, but something a little bit. I had this happen a couple of weeks ago. I went to the theater, and they have assigned seating at Regal now, and so I went there, and I paid for F1 and 2. So I walk up to my seat, and there's somebody sitting in it, and so I said to the lady, I said, ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat. I wasn't being attacking or anything. And she said, no, you need to check your ticket. Okay, here's my ticket. And then she kind of embarrassingly pulled her ticket out and said, oh, I'm in the wrong seat. All right, that's what we're talking about, right? But let me ask you this. Are you talking about, the question was, what does it feel like to be wrong? But really what we're talking about, your responses indicate what it feels like to realize you're wrong. But that's not the question I ask. The question I ask is, what does it feel like to be wrong? And the answer, according to Dr. Schultz, is it feels exactly the same way as it feels to be right. It doesn't, you don't feel anything. It's an intuition. You have decided that something's right or wrong. But of course, you could be confused. And so, whatever we want to say about this particular misunderstanding about feelings, let's be clear about this. In philosophy, we don't care about your feelings, honestly. People sometimes get their feelings hurt. Well, by the time we get to the romantic philosophers, they care. They care about your feelings. We'll have to get to the 1800s for them. But for the most part, philosophy says feelings matter zero to us. What matters is what are the reasons for what your beliefs are. What matters is rationality. That's what we're interested in. So this is the first misconception that's out there. The second one is this. Philosophy is the search for the meaning, finish it, of life. Yes. Of course that's what it is. Wrong. Not completely wrong, okay? Maybe partly true. And this is part of the problem with a lot of these conceptions is maybe they hit on some element of truth, but not necessarily. Now, why would I say that? I mean, isn't it true that, politicians and theologians and philosophers and literary authors and all of these people are giving us all kinds of ideas about, how we should think about and conceptualize the meaning of life. But in philosophy, remember, we don't take anything for granted. And so while it may be true that there is a meaning to life, there's a problem with this particular statement. Can anybody see what that is? What's embedded in the claim?
Search, so we don't have the answer, so there is no definite answer.
There is no definite answer. You're on the right track. Somebody else? Philosophy is the search for the meaning of life if it has one, right? What's embedded in this claim is that life has a meaning. And in philosophy, in fairness, we have to ask that question, does it have a meaning? Because all things are open. We consider all ideas. And so it is possible that life has a meaning. I personally think it does. But I have certain philosophical commitments that push me that way. And other people have philosophical commitments that push them the other way. They have a different way of conceptualizing things. For example, if I was a naturalist, if I was committed to the idea that there's only the natural world and that through random chance and causation, this world got to this place where it's at and life came into existence without any help of the divine and so forth, then that would then result in me being committed to the notion that it really doesn't have any purpose. right? Life doesn't have a purpose. If naturalism's true, then life doesn't have a purpose. I'd say the same thing about atheism. If atheism's true, then life doesn't have a purpose. It can't have one. If there's no divinity, then we are nothing more than a chance happening in the universe. And so if that's the case, then we are committed to the idea that life doesn't have a purpose. Now, unless you're a postmodernist, the postmodern philosophers come along, and usually they're committed to some form of naturalism or atheism in one way or another. And what they'll say is that, well, life doesn't have a meaning unless you give it one. It's up to you to infuse life with meaning. And so that is maybe one way to handle this problem. But notice this, it's a fiction. You see, it's a fiction of philosophy. If you say, well, life doesn't have any meaning unless you give it meaning, then what you're really saying is it doesn't really have any meaning. Ultimately, you're committed to the notion a priori that it doesn't have meaning. So that's the second one. Let's go to the third one. And this misconception is this: philosophy is simply being skeptical. Philosophy is simply being skeptical. Emphasis on skeptical. Emphasis on skeptical. That what philosophers are a bunch of people who are difficult to get along with for no reason. They argue for argument's sake. They really don't have any serious, they're not dealing with serious ideas. They're just being difficult. This is sometimes placed on philosophers. They're accused of this. But philosophers would very quickly say, no, that's not what we're about at all. We're thinking about very important topics and we're trying to get to the bottom of them. We're not necessarily willing to accept the status quo. We have questions and we want to get answers to those questions. What you could say about philosophers is that philosophers are inquisitive. They're curious. They want to know the way the world is. They want to understand why things work the way they do. All right, number 4. Philosophy is rank speculation. Philosophy is rank speculation. This particular misconception, I think, comes from people who want to portray philosophy in a kind of caricature kind of way. This is an attempt to dismiss it, say it's not that important. After all, a lot of the ideas are just stuff that people just made up. There's nothing substantial behind them. There's not critical thought. It's just conclusions people came up with and said, well, this is the way the world is, and therefore it shouldn't be trusted. So, kind of the prototypical view would be a group of students sitting around in a dorm room, maybe smoking a little weed, came up with a few ideas, wrote them down, said, that's philosophy, right? But of course, that's really not what philosophers do or even how we operate, but that's the way it's sometimes presented. Like philosophers just make things up without evidence or reasons. They just draw unsubstantiated conclusions and then say, this is the way the world is. I know a lot of professional philosophers. I don't know anybody that does that. If they did, they'd be laughed off out of the professional academy. So all of these are just kind of popular misconceptions. Philosophy is how you or I feel about something. It's a search for the meaning of life. It's simply being skeptical. Philosophy is rank speculation. All right, any questions about those? Okay. Well, let's now move on to what philosophy is. Okay. So this is a discussion. This entire discussion has been a discussion of what philosophy is not. Okay. I suspect some of you had some of these ideas. You may have had at least some version of some of these ideas, and that's okay. Like I said, we are wrong a lot. And by the way, if you wanted to do something on your journal one, this might be a good entry. This is something I thought philosophy was about. I turned out to be wrong about. Or you come up with your own, one that you heard, and think about it as we're talking about what it is here. All right. So what philosophy is? That's really what we want to spend the rest of our time on today. So let's go to this side of the board. What philosophy is. And the first thing I want to do is to give you the historical origins of it. We'll do the etymology of the word. Etymology. Does anyone know, what does etymology mean? It's the origin of words. So the etymology of the word is where the word comes from. Now philosophy it's from the ancient Grecian language. Greece is the cradle of civilization. And so it's where philosophy begins. It's where everything begins as far as Western civilization is concerned. It comes from a Greek word, philosophy. It's a combination of two words. Feline, and this is, I'm giving you a transliteration here, which means to love. It's the Greek infinitive feline, it means to love. And then it's combined with this word, Sophia, which means wisdom. To love wisdom. At some point, Socrates, who's maybe the first of the great philosophers, was doing his thing as he's walking around talking to people about what it means to be a good person and what an ethical life looks like. They asked him, what is it that you're doing exactly? And he thought about it for a while, and eventually he came up with, he says, I love wisdom. I'm talking to people about what it means to be wise. So he said, I guess you could call me a philosopher. I'm a lover of wisdom. So a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. That's where the word comes from. Now, what kind of wisdom are we talking about? All kinds. All kinds. In the ancient world, anybody who was interested in knowledge of any kind was called a philosopher. In the ancient world, anybody who was interested in knowledge of any kind was called a philosopher. People that you would call scientists today, in the ancient world, were called philosophers. People who we call mathematicians today were called philosophers. Historians, philosophers. Doctors, medical people, philosophers. Astronomers, philosophers. Biologists, philosophers. All of these fields were called philosophy until around the 17th century. And in the 17th century, there began to be a discussion amongst this big group of philosophers that are getting rather large at this point as to how to distinguish certain questions that were unanswered and questions that were answered, right? Because by the time we get to the 1700s, we're starting to figure some things out in ways that we hadn't been able to previously. And so what happens is there's a decision to separate something called science from philosophy. So philosophy, which has covered all these disciplines for all these centuries, morphs into something we now call science. Now, don't miss this. All science is rooted in philosophy. All science is rooted in philosophy, which tells you, okay, there's all kinds of philosophical issues that are going to be involved in any discussion of any scientific issue. Now, well, how do you make the distinction? At what point do you say, okay, this is now science. It's no longer considered in the field of philosophy. It's not a philosophical matter anymore. It's become a scientific matter. Here is the way it was dealt with. It seems that when definite knowledge concerning any subject becomes possible, this subject ceases to be called philosophy and becomes a separate science. Okay, so we understand now how that all these subject matters in the past that were being considered, one by one began moving from one category to another. Now, there's still questions that are not answered, right? In a class like this, we'll spend a lot of time kind of trying to wrestle with some of those, what we call perennial questions about us as human beings. Do we have free will, for example? Does God exist? Is there absolute right and wrong? These kinds of questions, or those questions stay in the philosophy side of things because we don't have definite knowledge about them. Now, you may think, well, once things move into scientific knowledge, then we don't have to worry about philosophy for them anymore. And you would be wrong. Because philosophy doesn't just end when you have scientific advance or technological advance or some kind of movement ahead in understanding, because with each move ahead, then there's new questions to be answered. So let me give you a few examples of this. So let's start off with bioethics. You know, we can do all kinds of cool stuff with DNA. I mean, we've mapped the human genome. We are learning to do things that even 20 years ago were thought to be ridiculous and impossible. I don't know if you paid any attention to this CRISPR technology, but this is going to be a game changer. I mean, it's huge. They're literally able to reprogram DNA using what, you know, I'm using the layman's term, but it's just kind of cutting and pasting. It's going to be a huge thing in coming decades. But that being said, we probably should ask questions about such advances. What should be the limits, if any? there's always going to be a philosopher doing the books on any of these disciplines. So a researcher who's finding new techniques for splicing DNA needs to have someone saying, should we do that or not? Asking those kinds of questions. And how many of you seen the movie I Am Legend? You ever see that? I don't know if you remember, but they had solved this problem. It was, it's kind of vaccination or something like that. It's supposed to help everybody. It ended up basically turning virtually everybody into zombies. When you start messing around with the DNA code, you better be careful, is the point. It could mean the end of our species. Write this down. It's the easiest thing in the world to think. It's the easiest thing in the world to think. It's the hardest thing in the world to think well. It's the easiest thing in the world to think. It's the hardest thing in the world to think well. You are literally surrounded by tens of thousands of people every day that are thinking. But I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, many of them are not thinking well. They haven't been trained to do it. They're not even trying to do it. And so what philosophy invites you to do is to develop skills that allow you to think well about a whole variety of subjects. Good at it now. That is what will prepare you for the future. Okay, let me give you 2 more definitions of philosophy. Philosophy is the task of thinking hard about the most important things. Philosophy is the task of thinking hard about the most important things. Philosophy is the task of thinking hard about the most important things. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm just saying that no human can think about everything in great detail. For example, I have no interest in thinking about this marker and why it works the way it does, why they made it black, how the ink works, what the structure of it is, all those things. They're not important for me to know. I don't need to think about that. But that's not the kinds of things that we're endeavoring to think about. We're trying to think about stuff that really matters. Now, it's fine if somebody else thinks about this and creates these wonderful things, but that's not what philosophy is built around. It's built around thinking about difficult and hard problems and trying to make sense of them, and things that impact your life, as you will see. All right, one other definition. This is a third way to think about philosophy, or third definition to philosophy. Philosophy is a critical study of fundamental beliefs. Philosophy is a critical study of fundamental beliefs and the grounds for them. Philosophy is a critical study of fundamental beliefs and the grounds for them. So grounds, what do I mean? Coffee grounds? No, I mean the basis. The basis of them. Grounds, that's what that means. Philosophy is a critical study of fundamental beliefs and the grounds for them. So that's a more technical definition. Now there's 4 branches to philosophy. And each branch attempts to answer a question. And what I'm about to give you is the kind of the comprehensive view of what philosophy is about. So let me just lay this forward for you. So The first branch is metaphysics. Metaphysics concerns theories of reality. Metaphysics concerns theories of reality. Metaphysics attempts to answer the question, what is real? What is real? What's the nature of reality? When someone says this is the way the world is, they've just made a metaphysical claim. If someone says there is no right and wrong, they've just made a metaphysical claim. They're saying that in this world there exists no morality. There's no objective morality. And you can see there's a connection to morality, which we're going to get to shortly, but they're making a larger claim than that. They're saying that in reality there is no ethical grid. It's just something we made up. It's a fiction of philosophy. That's a metaphysical claim. If someone says there is no free will, that's a metaphysical claim. If someone says there is free will, that's a metaphysical claim. If someone says God exists, that's a metaphysical claim. If someone says God does not exist, that's a metaphysical claim. They're saying the world is this way, and they're giving you one of their commitments, one of their philosophical commitments. All right, number 2. You're going to love these 50-cent words as we work our way along here. The next one, the next branch of philosophy is epistemology. Epistemology. Epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme. Episteme, if you knew what that meant, you would be golden, because ology just means study of. Episteme means to know, or knowledge. It's the study of knowing. It's epistemology concerns theories of knowledge. That's what it's interested in. And then the question that it tries to answer is how do we know? See, that's a different question than when you're asking about what the nature of reality is. It's a related question, because once somebody says the world is this way, then what's the next question? How do you know that? Right? So you can see that it's related, but it's not the same thing. The epistemology deals with things like theories of truth. It deals with questions of how we acquire knowledge. It deals with different theories about what knowledge is. How do we know we have it when we say we do? So it's that's a whole different area. And then thirdly, we have axiology. Axiology. Axiology concerns theories of value. Axiology concerns theories of value. Now this is interesting because it covers a bit more territory. Let me give you the question first, and then we'll talk about the territory it covers. It tries to answer the question, what is good? What is good? It's one of those terms we use a lot. We throw it around. It's another abstract concept. We say, that's good. Well, you know, what do we mean by that? I mean, we often use this term as a kind of descriptor, but not really know exactly what it is we're talking about. Axiology is study of values. So values, what kinds of values? Well, of course, you can probably guess one area that's going to be covered here is ethics. Ethics would be one thing that would be underneath axiology, because when we talk about the good, what is a good person? What does a good person look like? Usually in conceptualizing the good, we'll say the good has to do with something to do with right and wrong, and we'll talk about what that is. And so this isn't an ethics class. There is an introduction to ethics class that you can take, but we will deal with ethics in a very kind of basic way a few different times along the course of the semester. Axiology also concerns political and economic theories. political and economic. Again, what do we value as a civilization, as a people, as a country? In this country, we value a constitution. We live in a republic. We value democratic voting, individual rights, etc. We have certain things that we value, but and we say that's good. But in other countries, say socialistic countries, they would say, you know what, we value fairness more, and we value the group more, and we value other things. They would say less individual freedom and more just social, a social web to take care of more and more people. That's a better way. That's a good way of life. Communism, they'd have another way. They have a completely different format, the way they would think about it. And they'd say, this is good. So we have competing visions of the world politically and economically, different people defining good in a different way. Now what some people do is they'll make the quick jump to, well, it's all relative. Well, not necessarily. So you're making a metaphysical claim there, as well as an epistemological one that you shouldn't make, because after all, we can make judgments and say some systems do work better than others. There are some, let's take a tyranny. So we have a tyrant. We got Kim Jong-il in North Korea. We can say, well, look, I mean, the United States and the socialist countries are superior in some ways to that, because it allows for good more distributed amongst all the people in our countries as opposed to theirs. So we can make judgments about these things. We may not be able to easily discern, and this is part of what the debate is, about what's best. Is kind of a democratic republic better, or is a socialistic system better? And this is all open for debate. And it's the kind of thing that you would talk about in your government classes. Now, that's not what we do in here, but I'm bringing it up so that you realize this. When you talk about this stuff in government, it's philosophy. That's all it is. It's just a form of philosophy. Okay? So, all right, let me give you one more here underneath this. This is a value as well. Aesthetics. Aesthetics is the study of beauty. The study of beauty. And beauty is one of those topics that there's much confusion about out there. I bet you if I did a poll of this class right now and I said to you, well, how many of you would say beauty's in the eye of the beholder? Probably almost 100% of you would say that. Did you know that for most of history, nobody would have agreed with that? There are good reasons to say, no, beauty's objective. It is objective. There are things that we can look at. Now, what do you have to do? Well, you have to look at something and go, okay, that's really beautiful to me. Next question is, why? What about it makes it beautiful? And what philosophers have learned to do is abstract qualities that are essential qualities that go with beautiful things. And once you know that, you realize, well, it's really not subjective. It has those things. It doesn't need a human perceiver. It doesn't need a subjective opinion in order for it to be beautiful. It's just beautiful because it already has those features. It has what it takes to be beautiful. And the beauty exists within the thing itself. Again, that's a philosophical argument. Maybe we'll do one day on aesthetics. That's always a fun topic. We sometimes run out of time in this class, so I will try to work it in. We'll see. Let's get to the fourth branch here because we're running out of time. Logic. Logic. Logic concerns the formal rules of reasoning. And it asks the question, what is reasonable? What is reasonable? Now, this is a tool of philosophy. There's two different kinds of logic that we'll look at in this class. One type is called inductive logic. The other type is called deductive logic. Inductive and deductive logic. We'll work on both of those. This will be coming in the next couple of weeks. And honestly, it's pretty challenging. So make sure you show up for those days when we're having that conversation. We use this as a kind of tool. And then this tool helps us to talk about these things, right? And so logic allows us to make arguments that support our ideas that are in metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology.